All right. Yeah. I'm not quite sure what the Franklin expedition is, but I'm sure I'm going to find out now. But yeah, this is the disturbing disappearance of the Franklin expedition from Scary Interesting. So this should be good because their videos are good. So like and detailed. There are another detailed one like Lemon and that like. So this should be interesting. So yeah, let's go.
In 1845, two ships entered the dark waters of the frozen and barren Canadian archipelago in search of an elusive Northwest Passage. At the large mouth of the channel, they were met by two whaling ships who saw them off shortly afterward. These would be the last individuals to see the ships or the men on board ever again. For over a century, their whereabouts remained a mystery, but slowly over the past few decades, what happened to these ships and the men on board has been discovered, and it is far more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. This is Franklin's Lost Expedition. As always, viewer discretion is advised. Living in the mid-1800s must have felt similar to the digital boom of the 90s and 2000s or the post-war economy and tensions of the 1950s, because in just a few short decades, everything had changed. The Enlightenment and the end of the Napoleonic Wars had set a new way for much of the world. Steam engines had kick-started the Industrial Revolution, and for the first time in human history, we were close to having a map of the entire world. But to finish it, there was one final prize that eluded everyone who had tried. This was the Northwest Passage. At the time, England and many of the other world powers had been spreading their influence through trade and empire, but the shape of the Americas was a natural barrier to sea travel. Since the technology to create something like the Panama Canal wouldn't exist for some time, that meant that ships would either have to take the long way down around South America, then all the way back up the Pacific, or sail the other way around the globe. Either way, it was quite the journey. So the chance, however small, that a path might be found through the frozen Northwest Territories of Canada was too much for the British Admiralty to give up. And even if it did prove impossible for trade, the prestige of filling in the last navigable waterway on Earth was enough of a prize that some people devoted their entire careers to it. Like, for example, Sir John Barrow, second Secretary of the British Admiralty, aged 81 at the time, saw this as a chance to put one last grand feather in his cap before retirement. So he ordered a final expedition to be assembled and set out to choose its leader. Barrow's first two choices had both declined, one of which was William Parry, who had grown tired of the Arctic, and the wife of the other, James Ross, convinced him not to go. The third choice, Francis Crozier, was passed over by the Admiralty for being an Irishman and of low birth. Then the fourth choice, James Fitzjames, was seen as too young and inexperienced to lead such an undertaking. So finally, the fifth choice, and the man the expedition would be named for, was Sir John Franklin. This would actually be Franklin's third attempt to find the passage, having done so by sea and by land before with mixed success. His previous attempt had even led to the deaths of half his men, with the survivors resorting to eating moss and leather to avoid starvation. Afterward, Franklin returned in shame, known as the man who ate his boots. In spite of that, though,
It's crazy what the old days was like. Like, this is not that long ago. Do you know what I mean? It's not thousands and thousands of years ago. It's like to go to like America, you'd go on like a 3-year journey or something ridiculous. Do you know what I mean? How long was the Titanic? That was like, I don't know. I don't actually know. Was that a year journey? I don't know. But yeah, crazy.
was well liked by his men, and he was known to be kind and cared for their well-being, sometimes leading them in sermons and going out of his way to ensure their safety. He was also known to be a little overly enthusiastic and had previously gotten carried away when a goal was in front of him, rushing to the finish rather than doing things carefully. But a combination of care for his men in a dangerous place and the enthusiasm to see it through to the end wasn't necessarily a bad thing, and thankfully, he wouldn't be doing it alone. Although they were deemed inadequate to lead the expedition, Francis Crozier and James Fitzjames would be joining Franklin as his second and third and would be the captains of two ships under Franklin's command called the Terror and the Erebus. For the ships, there would be no expense spared and no cutting-edge technology left out. The lead ship, the Erebus, was a Hecla-class bomb vessel commissioned in 1826 and 105 feet long. The Terror was a little older and smaller and was a Vesuvius-class bomb vessel from 1813 and 102 feet long. Both ships were chosen because bomb vessels were meant to fire heavy mortar from their decks, so they had extra cross-bracing. That also allowed them to better withstand breaking through the ice in the north, but all of that was just standard. In addition to that, portions of the ship's wooden hulls had been doubled in thickness, with even more iron sheeting added to the bows and along the waterline for the expedition. Both ships also received vents for internal heating, as well as a brand new addition no ship in the Royal Navy had ever possessed before, which was a propeller. And not just that, both ships could even retract their propellers and rudders in recesses on the underside of their hulls to protect them from the ice.
Lie
To
down.
power this newly added propeller,
Lie
each ship
down.
carried a converted locomotive steam engine from the London and Greenwich Railway to drive the ships even in the absence of wind. These motors also required roughly a ton of fresh water per hour and spurred another invention to be included, which was desalination equipment to turn seawater into fresh water. The expedition would also bring with it one of the first types of photographic cameras ever to be sold to the public, called a daguerreotype camera. They also even had an insulated diving suit on board if ice ever needed to be removed from rudders or propellers. These features are obviously commonplace today, and the Arctic is largely known about, but to the men actually going on the expedition, it might have felt like going to space. Only 6 of the expedition's 24 officers had been to the Arctic before, and to anyone seeing it for the first time, it might as well have been another planet. Compasses would shift and wander because of how close to the pole they were. Months could pass without the sun setting or rising. The entire ocean turns to solid most of the year, and the land is so barren that you will only ever see white snow, grey rocks, and dark blue waters. On the 19th of May, 1845, the Erebus and Terror set sail to Greenhithe, just east of London, and began their journey. Between them, they carried 134 men, a ship's cat, a dog named Neptune, a monkey named Jack, which was a gift from Lady Franklin, 2 tons of tobacco, 7,500 liters of liquor, around 12,000 books, theater costumes, sports gear, and one more brand new invention.
Isn't that the name of the monkey in Pirates of the Caribbean in the first one?
Critical to the mission, which was 16,000 tin cans of food. These included fruit and vegetables to stave off scurvy and would for the first time comprise nearly all of an expedition's rations. The ship set sail up, stopping at Stromness in Scotland, and then across the Atlantic to Whalefish Islands on the west coast of Greenland with 2 other ships accompanying them. The 2 ships would then top up the supplies of the Terror and Erebus before departing back to England and leaving the expedition on their own. While they were on the islands, 5 members of the expedition would also be discharged and sent home after falling ill during the Atlantic crossing. Before the expedition set off again, the crew spent a few days ashore, where they wrote their last letters home and enjoyed what relative warmth they could. In the letters, they said the officers had already begun their scientific work, tracking the weather and other natural phenomena. Franklin had also reportedly banned swearing and drunkenness, but there were doubts about how effective that would be with the sailors. But overall, the crew was confident and excited. They were about to step off on the adventure of a lifetime and mark their names in the history books. The expedition set sail once again on the 12th of July, 1845, with 129 men aboard. 2 whaling ships met up with them in Baffin Bay, waiting for an opening in the ice before seeing them off into a large channel known as Lancaster Sound. This was the last time the Franklin expedition was ever seen alive. After entering the channel, they just vanished, and it would take over 150 years and dozens of expeditions and investigations to piece together what happened to them. These investigations are even still ongoing, but here is what we do know. Sailing was slow in the north. Even during the summer, most channels are packed with ice, and the ships need to push floating chunks of ice out of the way as they progressed. If this was done too quickly, this would gradually damage the ship's bows and potentially sink them. This would also show one of the first nails in the expedition's coffin, which had always been there, it just hadn't been realized yet. The steam engines carried by both ships, which powered their revolutionary brass propellers, could only produce 25 horsepower at 4 knots. This was only a tenth of the power of icebreakers less than half their size had at the time. This feature wasn't a mystery, however, as the Admiralty had only included 12 days worth of fuel for the steam engines, which would have been much better used for heat than propulsion. It's likely that these were seen as more of a psychological benefit to the crew and to the British public, and were only of very limited use. As a result, the expedition would only travel around 800 kilometers, navigating around Cornwallis Island, before circling back to Beechey Island by the first winter freeze. This put them only around 350 kilometers from Baffin Bay where they began, but all things considered, this was actually decent progress. Throughout the winter, both ships sheltered in a cove between Beechey Island and the much larger Devon Island to avoid the churning sheets of ice that piled on top of one another in the high wind. Once the Erebus and Terror were frozen in sea ice, the crew gathered snow high enough to pack against the sides of both ships as insulation. Up top, the sails were taken down and a massive canvas tent covered most of the vessel's deck space. This would have given the crew slightly more space to move around in without being fully exposed to the elements. Over the winter of 1845 and into 1846, 3 members of the crew were buried on Beechey Island. Pneumonia is believed to be the final cause of death, but also not the only cause. By then, the second nail in the expedition's coffin was slowly being revealed, and unfortunately, it was one they'd been eating and drinking for months. The 16,000 cans of food that they brought on the expedition with them had been a rush job from the lowest bidder. Improper lead soldering had left traces inside the cans described like trails of wax down a candle, and many of the cans weren't even properly cooked or fully sealed either. So not only was there lead, but rotten food, botulism, and mold in many of the cans.
Jeez.
Hair and tissue samples taken in 1984 confirmed that the men buried on Beachy Island had substantial lead levels in their bodies. But incredibly, the levels found were still too much, even for just the canned food. Apparently, the water desalination equipment they brought with them should never have been used to supply drinking water because its lead piping could have easily corroded when exposed to sea salt. In addition to that, another theory to explain the unexpectedly high levels of lead in the bodies was a critical lack of zinc in the crew's diet. A lack of which over time causes the body to slowly begin cannibalizing its own bones, releasing even more lead into the bloodstream. So this combination of bad food, lead poisoning, and zinc deficiency made any disease the crew encountered that much worse.
And you think, like, these men are brave. Like, well, I think people were in general in them days, but, like, do you know what I mean? It's kind of no one's fault because no one really knew. No one had done it. Well, I suppose people had traveled around the world or whatever, but yeah, people didn't know these things until you know later on. So they're like literally the guinea pigs for today, really. But yeah, let's carry on. This is fascinating.
Damaging their immune systems, causing brain fog, and slowly building up as the years went on. Even worse than that, the 5 men sent back home from Greenland before the ships even reached the Canadian archipelago had tuberculosis, meaning there was already tuberculosis on those ships. In any case, the next year, the ship sailed south towards what was then known as King William Land on the very edge of the known map. At the time, it was unclear if this was an island or not, and Franklin had to make a choice. If he sailed down the eastern side of King William Land, and it was an island, he might reach more southern waters faster, but if it wasn't, he'd have to backtrack some unknown distance. The second option was to set sail west around King William, since that was the direction they were trying to go anyways. Given that choice, it seemed less risky to sail west, and so that was the choice he made. But in doing so, Franklin accidentally brought the ships into one of the most dangerous places in the passage. The west side of King William Island is like a funnel, narrowing down and collecting ice flows from 2 channels before pinching them between itself and several smaller islands. The expedition had unknowingly sailed into some of the densest ice flows in the world, and was given no chance to correct their mistake before being locked on the 12th of September.
Jeez.
They would then spend the winter of 1846 to 1847 on the ice once again. Back home in January of 1847, Lady Franklin got more and more concerned. Although it was expected that her husband would spend at least one winter on the ice, 2 just didn't sit right with her. First she asked, and then she basically demanded that the Admiralty do something and prepare a rescue operation, but the Admiralty maintained their confidence that all was well. They did at the very least begin to plan a search if that became necessary. This didn't convince Lady Franklin though, even slightly, and she went directly to the British public, calling in every favor she had to get the word out. This included a personal friend of hers, Charles Dickens, who used his standing as the most popular writer in England to champion her cause.
Jesus.
Already, the crew of the expedition desperately needed rescue, but even they might not have realized it yet. With the improper sealing of many of their cans, there was another fatal side effect. The Royal Navy had used bottled lemon juice for generations to prevent scurvy, but the more modern practice was canned fruits, just as it was with the expedition. The problem was, with an improper seal or contamination, vitamin C is chemically unstable and will degrade over time. They likely didn't notice it during the first winter, or maybe even the second, but they had much less good fruit aboard than they thought they did. Then, in May of 1847, 8 members of the expedition would hike ashore with letters, crossing the ice to King William Island, and leave 2 copies of a report for future explorers to find. The letter stated where the ships were wintering with a set of coordinates. It also reported their previous stay at Beachy Island, the trip around Cornwallis Island, that Sir John Franklin was commanding, and finally it read, "All well." The handwriting is believed to be that of Captain Fitzjames, and the 2 officers who went ashore signed both messages. These messages were then placed in stone cairns to keep them safe, and there was no mention of anything wrong, but that was about to change. The crew had likely expected to leave soon, which is why they left messages in the first place, but that year, the Arctic hit record low summer temperatures. June, July, and into August, the ice never melted. The Erebus and the Terror and all of their crew remained stuck in the ice through the summer and then into fall. Modern ice core samples have even confirmed that 1845 to 1859 was the peak of an unusually cold 50-year period with less seasonal melting than any period in the
Jeez.
previous 1,000 years. During this time, the Terror began to list heavily in the ice, and most of the crew moved to the Erebus to share heat and consolidate what decent rations they had left. The Terror was instead used as a cold storage for excess supplies and for the bodies as they began to mount. Then, on the 11th of June 1847, Captain Sir John Franklin would join the dead. By then, the symptoms of scurvy and lead poisoning would both be apparent to the doctors and scientists aboard the ships, but there wasn't much they could do to stop them at this point. No notable plant life grows in the Canadian Arctic, and the wildlife could be just as dangerous. The crews did have hunting tools, spears, muskets, and other equipment with them, but the Arctic seals, polar bears, and fish all carry botulism type E. This is the only strain of botulism that can exist in such cold temperatures. The native Inuit had spent thousands of years building genetic resistance to it, but the same couldn't be said for Europeans. A single piece of meat improperly cooked, or the blood of a butchered animal getting on another piece of food could be a death sentence. Finally, in the winter of 1847 to 1848, with no sign of the expedition, the Admiralty agreed to act. Something was wrong, and they couldn't afford to ignore the year-long public outcry any longer. In early 1848, a search and rescue operation was sent from both the Pacific and Atlantic ends of the passage, as well as overland. One of the men to participate in the search was James Ross, who was one of the men who had passed up a chance to lead the expedition at the request of his wife. He then set sail on the HMS Enterprise to try and save the life of his close friend, Francis Crozier. At the same time, the Admiralty offered a £20,000 reward for anyone who assisted the expedition, or around $2.5 million today, and $10,000 for any information about what happened. In April of 1848, it must have been clear to the expedition that they had no choice. Their food was due to run out that summer, and even those estimates had assumed that the 16,000 cans would all be edible. Even with rationing, the end of their supplies was approaching, and with the seas frozen, they would have to walk. So on the 25th of April, they returned to King William Island and left another letter by writing in the margins of the first. It said that Sir John Franklin was dead, along with 9 officers and 15 crew in total. It also stated that the ships had been deserted on the 22nd, and 105 survivors under Crozier would attempt to walk 240 kilometers or 150 miles to Backfish River, also known as Back River. Then once they were there, they would try to row to the nearest trading station. So after a year and 7 months of unending winter, the crew finally left, and by then, the situation was desperate. Many of them were unable to handle the physical strain due to being weak, sick, and malnourished from years and living in such horrible conditions. Over 20 bodies from the Erebus were found on the coast of King William Island at a series of camps where they had no choice but to leave the dying behind. It would have been bad enough if it was just a walk, but it wasn't. The closest trading post was still hundreds of kilometers upriver, so the men had to bring the ship's boats with them. These were massive rowing vessels, loaded with as many supplies as each could carry. Each one of these was roughly 3,600 kilograms or 8,000 pounds. Then, with the ice floes piling up against one another in the wind, freezing in uneven shapes, and King William Island being rough limestone gravel, putting the boats onto sledges was the only option. So as they were slowly starving, suffering internal bleeding from the onset of scurvy, and poisoned from years of lead exposure, it would have been day after day of agony to pull the boats they needed to live.
Think this is all the same journey, and it's been going on for years. Like, maybe for like up until the first year, it was kind of going all right for them. And now it's basically just a slow death, a slow trying to survive death. It's, yeah. Just think what it was like for them. Like, meant, and especially like you said, like, you've got no idea what's out there. It's not like today where you can watch things on the Arctic or, do you know what I mean? And you can see pictures of it and videos and see the animals, and do you know what I mean? You can learn pretty much everything about the world without even stepping foot out your front door. But back then, they had none of that information. They are just basically out there in basically no man's land, bleeding, dying, exhausted, cold, scared. Do you know what I mean? All of that, and still soldiering on. Like, that's some tough, tough people. But I think people just do. I think, like, I don't think there's any difference from people then to people now. I think in the right circumstances, that comes out in people. The kind of the instinct to survive is strong in everything.
At least some of them did. With the hindsight of 150 years, we know that the trek south wasn't a unified one. Groups and individuals broke off from the main party, either intentionally because of bad weather or from being abandoned. But those groups didn't give up either. In fact, bodies have been found in over a dozen different locations. Some took parallel or alternate routes south, while others, especially those who fell out of the march early on, even returned to the ships where food, fuel, and shelter still existed. That summer, in 1848, was when the food was expected to run out, had everything gone to plan. Even still, though, decades and centuries later, unopened cans would be found aboard the wrecks of both ships and at numerous landing sites.
Jesus, hold on 2 seconds. 2 seconds. Alright, let's carry on. Let's go.
It seems at some point the crew must have realized the dangers of their own rations and chose to go without them. Then, sometime between July and August 1849, it's speculated that the Erebus was freed from the ice. This is because Inuit have claimed to have seen a 3-masted ship off the coast of the Royal Geographical Society Islands and to have witnessed white men with guns and pikes hunting caribou near the Adelaide Peninsula.
Who saw
This
that?
story is also reinforced by the fact that sometime between July and August 1849, it's speculated that the Erebus was freed from the ice. This is because Inuit have claimed to have seen a 3-masted ship off the coast of the Royal Geographical Society Islands and to have witnessed white men with guns and pikes hunting caribou near the Adelaide Peninsula. This story is also reinforced by the fact that the Inuit claimed that the group had a non-Inuit dog with them, which was presumably Neptune. This was a detail that the natives couldn't have otherwise known about. Whatever the case, a year later in 1850, another group of Inuit claimed to have found another abandoned ship stuck in the ice still. Climbing aboard, they found the ship's stove still burning and several of the bodies of crew members in their bunks still. At some point in the summer of that year, the main party splintered further and many of its members died in an area known as Starvation Cove. Smaller groups also continued down to Chantry Inlet along various coastlines and paths. One group of 4 was reportedly encountered by the Inuit, and weirdly, only one of the men was on the verge of starvation. It was later learned that he was the only one who had refused to engage in cannibalism. The Inuit then took them in to feed them and tend to them, and in that time, another member of the group died of disease before the remaining 3 were strong enough to continue. Later in August, a search party would come upon the first 3 graves on Beechey Island. This would have been the first concrete confirmation that something had happened to the expedition, and these would have been some of the first to die early on before they traveled south. Following this discovery and concern about what might have happened to the rest of the crew, as well as Lady Franklin's continued public concerns, finding the crew drew more effort than even discovering the passage had. No less than 11 ships set sail in 1850 with more to come, several of which would have accidents of their own in the coming years. As a quick side note, one of these ships, the HMS Resolute, would be abandoned during the search and later recovered by an American whaling ship in the next thaw. The wood from it would then be used to make the Resolute desk and gifted to the US President, which has since been a permanent fixture in the Oval Office. Incredibly, another ship, the HMS Investigator under Captain Robert McClure, would actually find the legendary Northwest Passage while looking for Franklin. But then, after sailing in from the west side of the Arctic, this ship would also become trapped in ice and abandoned after 2 years. In 1853, after a rescue party marched out and met them, from the HMS Resolute, the 2 crews then combined their resources to make it to safety over the following year. All of this is to say that while it's easy to point at all the things wrong with the Franklin expedition, the place itself was just as much responsible. Those are just 2 of many examples of ships intended to rescue the expedition and later needing rescue themselves, in spite of being prepared for it and knowing that help would come much faster. Of the remaining Franklin crew, the most successful known group of survivors made it as far as Chesterfield Inlet on the western coast of Hudson Bay by using a lighter inflatable boat. But for all the progress they made, it just wasn't enough. Over the following decade, different Inuit groups claimed to have seen as many as 40 men traveling south in 1850, but by 1851, the group or groups had dropped to as little as 4 men, no longer pulling any boats. It's believed that by the end of 1851, most or all of the members of the crew had died of starvation or exposure. At the same time, during that era, the accounts of the Inuit weren't really believed, so the searchers didn't use much of the information that could have been available to them. Then, in 1854, a Scottish surgeon and explorer met several Inuit who gave him brass buttons and other items from the expedition as proof of their claims. They also claimed to have come across a grave with as many as 30 corpses and evidence of the men cutting, cooking, and cannibalizing their fellow crewmates. These claims were again quickly rejected by the Victorian public, the families of the crew, and quite vocally by Charles Dickens, who went on to write 3 stories discrediting this idea. This left the Inuit testimony by the wayside for well over 100 years until only recently academic sources began to compare and corroborate their accounts.
Thing is, I know like it's kind of barbaric, and England at that time wasn't barbaric like that. and so saying that you cannibalized. But I think now, if it happened, people would have more of an understanding, because, do you know what I mean? It's all right in cushy England saying, no, they didn't, but these men are surviving. These men are real hardened survivors that I don't even know what's keeping them going. But if you're in that situation, you do what you got to do. Do you know what I mean? It just is what it is, right? None of us can really understand and appreciate what them men were going through and thinking, and do you know what I mean? When you're starving, again, none of us in like the Western world at least will know that, for at least for a while. I think eventually we will. But at the moment, you don't really know what it's like to starve like that, where you will eat anything. Do you know what I mean? People eating leather and whatever. But yeah.
In spite of the disbelief at the time, many of the Inuit stories are consistent in their major details, even if the timing isn't always right or the translation wasn't flawless. For instance, one group claims to have seen Captain Crozier and one other man as late as 1852 to 1858. This doesn't necessarily mean the account was incorrect, but rather that the timekeeping was off or mistranslated somehow. For the main search party, though, it wouldn't be all the way until 1858 that a first-hand account would finally be found, when another expedition funded by Lady Franklin herself came upon the cairn containing the two final reports from the Erebus and Terror. Only then, at least 8 years after the last of the crew had most likely died, did they finally have hard evidence to go on. 10 years after that, in 1869, another explorer met a group of Inuit on his second of 3 expeditions. They claimed to have met Franklin's men as well and offered them what food they could, but there were just too many to save. To feed their own families, the Inuit were forced to leave the men to their fates, which also didn't do anything to help the British public's opinion of the Inuit. Finally, in 1993, 145 years after the search began, the expedition's final camp was located and every
Jesus.
detail of cannibalism the Inuit had spoken of was confirmed. Cut marks on the bones showed attempts to remove the hands, feet, and heads, and the crew had even attempted to drill into the largest bones to extract the marrow inside. Today, we still don't know what happened to the majority of the men. Even with that final camp, only a fraction have been found, and many probably never will be. However, we might soon get a better idea of what happened at least, because in 2014, the wreck of the Erebus was found in Crampton Bay, remarkably preserved. It was also right where the Inuit said it would be, off the Adelaide Peninsula, lending more credence to the story of some of the crew hunting with them and the sightings of the dog Neptune. Then, even more incredibly, 2 years later, the Terror would be found in, ironically enough, Terror Bay. This bay had even been given the name in the ship's honor without any idea that the ship was actually there.
Jeez.
With both ships found, archaeological expeditions had been planned for the year 2020, but obviously those were interrupted. So finally, in May of 2022, limited work resumed. This means that there might be significant updates to this story over the next few years, and the true last moments of the Franklin expedition. Hello everyone, and welcome to Scary Interesting. I have some exciting news. In the near future, we're going to be starting a Scary Interesting podcast. This will feature brand new Scary Interesting content, similar to what you see here on YouTube, but in an audio-only format, wherever you listen to podcasts. The video portion takes a lot of time and effort to create, so this is a way for us to bring you new content more frequently. The only content that probably won't make it onto the podcast are the stories that are map and diagram heavy, where a visual portion is really crucial. In addition to that, there are less restrictions on the types of content that can be on podcast platforms, so some of the stories will be even crazier than what you're used to. In any case, as the first episode release date is finalized, I will make an announcement with all the details. Thank you all so much for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.
Please look at her. You're too big for this. Come on in, say hello. You happy now? Are you saying hello? Don't lick me. Yes, okay, you big lunatic. We're going out now. Yeah, that was great. That was a great video. I'm definitely going to do more of them. Right, get down, you big lump. No. No. Oh, this is not going well. But yeah, that was a great video. Fascinating. And just imagining what these people went through. Yeah, it's madness. Madness. Are you alright, are ya? You big lump. got no manners, this girl. All right, we're going out. Right, I can't even turn the video off. Come on, Nala, get down. Come on. Good girl. See, that's why you can't come up, because you're too hard to put down. But yeah, everything's going wrong. But yeah, we'll definitely do more of these. He's got like 5 videos of expeditions, historical expeditions that obviously went wrong. But yeah, that was fascinating, and Charles Dickens involved. Yeah, but yeah, that's the reaction. Sweet.